Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 19, and today I'm here with Debbie Reber talking about neurodiversity. Debbie is a parenting activist, New York Times best-selling author of the book Differently Wired, and the founder of Tilt Parenting, a website, top podcast, and online community for parents who are raising differently wired children, currently living with her husband and son in the Netherlands. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. Shout out to our new patron, Lydia Lim. As Sky likes to say, thanks for being awesome. If you are loving the Sage Family Podcast, you can become a part of it too through Patreon at patreon.com/sagefamily, where you can support these important conversations, help make this show great, and get rewards doing it, like a signed copy of the Sage Homeschooling book. I intentionally have no advertisements or sponsored posts of any kind, so it really is all of you throwing sticks into this virtual campfire that keeps the flames burning. One of the ways we change the world for the better is by aligning our money with our values, which is why I support the podcasts I believe in, and I hope you'll join me in doing the same. Our big family adventure for September was taking a 4-hour road trip for yurt camping at Nehalem Bay State Park Campground on the Oregon coast with a big group of unschooling families from all over the Pacific Northwest. One of the places we stopped along the way was Arcadia Beach, where I watched as the boys timed it perfectly so they could run and jump onto the rocks before the waves rushed back in and trapped them. I have moments like these that feel so affirming, like the universe is whispering, yes, this is exactly what children are meant to be doing. And as I feel my bare feet in the warm sand, the salty wind blowing through my hair, and my husband's strong hand in mine, I know this is exactly where I'm meant to be, too. We arrived at sunset to 44 unschooling kids running wild and free in nature, and my kids and their friends just jumped straight into the ocean waves, temp in the 50s, fully clothed. We spent the next 4 days laughing, hugging, and chatting as our kids climbed trees and bodyboarded with friends new and old. We took our sweet time on the journey home, stopping whenever inspiration struck to enjoy lunch in a small nearby town with friends, beaches, a river of clouds flowing through a forest valley, a fish hatchery where we got to feed some big white sturgeon, even a rainbow. If you want to see photos and videos of this adventure, then head on over to Sage Parenting on Instagram and follow along. Today, Debbie is joining me to share a conversation on neurodiversity. We're talking differently wired kids here today. I stumbled upon Debbie's podcast, Tilt Parenting, and promptly binged a great many episodes. The perspective and expertise voiced through conversations on her podcast are a breath of perspective-shifting fresh air for parents of neurodiverse kids. Then she went and wrote an incredible book, Differently Wired, Raising an Exceptional Child in a Conventional World, that resonated with me so strongly. Seriously, so much highlighting. If you have ever felt like your child is a square peg and society's expectations for them are a round hole, then you're gonna want to read this book. Granted, I do a lot of work to blow up those expectations because that round hole isn't a good fit for the natural child, period. But especially for those of us who have felt hammered by that lack of fit, this book is great. Now, tell us your story, Debbie. Who are you? What are you passionate about? What about your relationships in life fulfill you? And what is your relationship with this topic of neurodiversity?
Well, first of all, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm so grateful to hear that the book resonated with you. That means so much to me. And yeah, as you said, so my name's Debbie. I'm the mom of a 14-year-old differently wired son who I homeschool. I've been homeschooling now. We're in our 6th year. And we are, yeah, I know, right? I can't believe it. It's been a big blur, a mostly good blur. And yeah, raising a kid who is that kind of square peg has really kind of honed in on a passion for me. I've always been someone who has been involved in supporting groups that were marginalized. And I worked for many, many years before I came to this work, writing books and speaking to teen girls and young women and doing more confidence building, self-esteem building work. So I've always had this kind of draw to supporting communities and helping share information that would help others learn from, I guess, my own mistakes or my own journey. And so that's what brought me to this work. And yeah, that's such a great question. What about my relationships in life fulfill me? And
it's kind of my version of the question, what do you do? Which really is limiting.
I really love it. I am in this really incredible position now where for the first time ever, my passion in terms of my work and my career, which I've always had, I've always been writing and volunteering and producing. I used to work in television production. I have all these pieces of me and all this expertise. And now I've become an expert in my differently wired child and really dived into, all the research and just really what is involved when you're raising a child who's moving through the world differently. And so it's all come together in the most fulfilling way. I always say that I'm just really, really living the heck out of my life. And it's because of who my child is. It's because of who our family is and how we've kind of adapted to support him and the choices we've made along the way, which I can tell you more about later or whenever you want.
Yes. Oh, we are so going to dive in. Okay, so I like the term neurodiverse, and I know you like the term differently wired, and you've used atypical in your book. Well, what are we talking about here? How do we know if our family belongs in this club?
Well, I use the term differently wired to describe any way of being neurologically atypical. So, which I think is really a lot of us. It's a lot of people, many more than, we think it's, just a few kids who are on the spectrum or, this 1 in 42 or whatever. It's so much bigger than that. So if you start really looking at different ways of being neurodivergent, we're talking about kids who are gifted. We're talking about kids with ADHD, anxiety, sensory issues, yes, on the autism spectrum, sensory processing disorder, dyslexia, dysgraphia, so even just being a highly sensitive person. So there are so many ways that we can experience the world that all, the term neurodiverse means that there are variances within human brain function that are within the range. I mean, that's the experience. There are these normal variances. So really, we're all kind of moving through the world in our own unique way. And so we need to expand a definition of what it means to be normal, or, kind of maybe just get rid of the round hole altogether.
Yes. Because, in the Sage Homeschooling book, I talk a little bit about neurodiversity. And in it, I explain that neurodiversity is a strength-based approach to learning and disability that argues diverse neurological conditions are within the normal spectrum of human experience and might even be considered advantageous evolutionary adaptations as opposed to pathologized disabilities. The movement challenges which cognitive styles are normal and which are disorder. It takes an empowering view that individuals are not defective, and diagnoses and or treatment are often a reflection of simply fitting outside the box of our cultural convenience.
Well, you said it a lot more clearly than I just described it, but I would say yes to all of that.
I read it from the book.
But yeah, and I love that you mentioned, I do love the strength based approach. I totally believe that in every fiber of my being. And I also do see this as an evolutionary progression of society. So I think we really do need to shift our thinking in terms of how we're supporting and accepting differently wired people and differently wired kids in particular.
Yes, and that acceptance piece is usually the first piece that we come to, the first block that we run up against when we're trying to parent a differently wired child. One of my most popular memes of all time is, your expectations are the problem, not your child. And there's a reason that resonated with so many people. It's true of parenting all children, and especially true of parenting differently wired kids. The first step in all of my coaching work with families is this piece: letting go of who you think your child should be and accepting who they are. This almost always entails allowing yourself a moment of grief. You have to mourn the death of the idea you had in your mind of who your child would be and the life you envisioned for them. And you have to feel that fully before you can move through it to the other side into acceptance. And I'll link to my I Stumble blog post for anyone who wants to read through the details of my very messy journey through that process. So how does acceptance or lack thereof show up in parenting a neurodiverse kiddo?
Well, I think you just, what you touched upon is really a lot of what I share in my book too. I mean, it really is about our expectations, and it's about not being willing to accept reality, and it is that dirty word should, which just gets in our way all the time. I banned it from my lexicon a long time ago. My husband still uses it sometimes, and I'm always saying, well, yes, and he should be doing this, or this shouldn't be happening. I'm like, and it is. So how are we going to kind of move on? So I think that that's a big piece of it, is really getting honest with yourself about, and I love that you use the word more, and I talk about that too. Like, I think you have to get honest with yourself and be forgiving with yourself, gentle with yourself for being human, in this, and really kind of breaking down, beyond, how is this not meeting my expectations? But maybe I even have some negative stigmas that I've been holding on to about neurodiversity. And now I'm raising this kid who is the embodiment of that. Like, how do I reconcile that? So we really have to kind of examine all of that, be forgiving with ourselves through it, and strive to do better while we're kind of accepting that we're on a big learning curve, and that's okay.
Yes, in the book you said guilt-free grief, which I loved that you tacked on that qualifier, and I could not agree more.
Yeah. I mean, there's just no room for it. It doesn't benefit anybody, least of all our kids, to feel guilty or shame around, choices we've made or things that we're feeling.
Yeah, around feelings, because feelings are what they are. And when we can sit with them and get to know them, then we can move through them.
Yes, absolutely.
So connection is the foundation for all human thriving. And I want to touch on one of the important ways connection shows up in parenting differently wired kids: becoming fluent in the language of our children. Now, again, this is important for all children, but it is essential for parenting kids with neurodiversities because their language is atypical. It's often not our native tongue. So how do they receive love? What subtle cues do I see and hear in my child that communicate to me their struggle, especially in that sensitive window right before their behavior/communication gets big? What are their triggers? What sensory things do they experience as soothing? I sometimes tell my coaching clients to study their child like a scientist, which can remove some emotional reactivity and get to this place where you value each interaction as a learning opportunity, and then to journal their observations. I can hear Jonathan Van Ness's voice in my head from Queer Eye saying, let's get curious. So what advice do you have for parents to become fluent in the language of their child, and why do you think it's important?
Well, I love that idea of being a scientist. As you were saying that, I'm imagining like a parent, like with a notebook, like, okay, interesting. I wonder what this means, because that really is, that idea that all behavior is communication is kind of the starting point. And I think I think it is an ongoing, deep dive and really this full immersion experience of being curious and trying to figure everything out. So, I think one of the things I share with parents is to remember that there's always a reason. And especially when you have a child who is behaving in a way that can be just so unexpected. I hear from a lot of parents whose kids just make it this what they would call really big deal out of something that shouldn't be a big deal, these kind of big overreactions. And often there's so much more going on. That big overreaction, quote unquote overreaction, was triggered most likely by something that could have happened that morning or even days ago. So we really do have to recognize that this isn't random. There's a meaning behind it, and our job is to find out, especially when a child's younger and they can't really verbalize it as well, or they're not in touch as much with their feelings, like where did this come from? Because when we can do that, we're not going to judge the behavior. We're not going to take it personally, which a lot of us do, because if we're the recipient of said behavior, that can feel pretty lousy. So, and tied in with that, I think it's really important that parents get to know their own baggage. And, there's an example I use of a parent who, maybe at work has a colleague or a boss or someone who isn't really respecting them, who's treating them poorly or making them look bad in front of other people. And then maybe they're hanging out with their child in a public place and their child does one thing and that parent is reacting with all of this other baggage. Like, well, you're not going to disrespect me. I've been disrespected all day, or whatever it is. We need to understand what our personal triggers are, the things that are going to cause us to misinterpret what our child's doing. And that's work that we can do on our own. So those are a couple ways that we can really kind of lean in and start to understand, what our child's saying to us. I can share more, or you tell me if you want to.
Well, yeah. On. So let me just jump in real quick and say that that scientist piece. There's one thing that came to mind in what you were talking about, and that's when you can start by observing your child like a scientist, and especially if you're like journaling observations, it creates this window between the things you actually observe, like the helpful cues, that getting to know their language, and the meaning that you assign what's happening. Because when we're not being very conscious with that process, our kid will do or say something and we get tangled up in our own triggers and we go straight to the meaning. But when you approach it like a scientist first makes their observations, right? It's just data. Like they're just noticing the data. They're being really curious. And then after the experiment, like after they've culled all of the data, then they sit down in a different frame of mind, in a different setting, and they start wondering what meaning could be attached to these different things that they're observing. And I think that's really, really essential to get that space between those two processes.
Absolutely. And the time to get space isn't in the moment.
Right.
Because often the behavior that we really need to interpret is big behavior or behavior that can be considered inappropriate or, is something that we are feeling a sense of urgency around, but that distance is really important. I totally agree.
Yeah, and because so often what we're triggered by is the meaning that we're assigning what's happening, not even necessarily by what's actually happening.
That's exactly right. And one thing I would just add to that fluency piece is that we also want to not only learn what our child is saying to us through their behavior and their words and their actions, but we need to make sure that what we're communicating to them is understood in a way that they can receive it, right? We learned a long time ago that communication is a two-way street. And so it's important to continuously be curious about, wow, okay, so I thought that we explained this, and now I'm getting the sense that this wasn't actually information that was understood or didn't have the effect that I was hoping. So clearly, I need to find another way to communicate in a way that my child can receive and understand the information.
Yes, taught is not the same as learned.
Exactly.
Well, and yes. I knew you touched on the whole doing the work on yourself being even more, if not just as important as helping your kid to do their work. I think the topic of mirroring in the context of parenting infants may have been the first article I ever wrote for Sage Parenting 10 years ago, and it's something I am still talking about on the regular. There are mirror neurons in the brain that cause us to mirror the emotional state of the people we are in connection with. This force is powerful. It means that one of the most significant things you can do as a parent is manage your own emotional regulation. What are your triggers? What are you feeling in your body right now? What are your coping strategies or calming techniques? What steps do you move through to calm your storm? How do you experience love from the people who want to help you in those hard moments? You have to be fluent in your language too. So what does that mean for this conversation on parenting differently wired kids? Well, a whole lot of these kids are intense, sensitive, and struggle with emotional regulation. So I'm going to say something that I really want you to hear. You cannot control them, but you can control yourself. I used to always tell parents of infants to be the state you want to see in your baby. And now I'm telling you to be the emotional anchor when your child is in a storm. Plus, you'll be role modeling all the things we want to help our kids with. We all have challenges. We get to know ourselves better. We try accommodations. We ask for help. We learn, and on it goes. That's the journey. How has mirroring and role modeling shown up in your life and relationship with your son?
Oh my gosh, this is a whole other episode, but let me just say that yes, this is very much my work at this particular moment as we're having this conversation. I was just reading an article on Karen Young's website, Hey Sigmund. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
Yeah,
but
she talks a lot about anxiety.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I love her perspective. And I was reading an article on parenting teens, and she was just saying the importance of basically you're loaning out your prefrontal cortex to your child. And I was like, yep,
Oh, I love that.
all I'm doing right now. So, yeah, I mean, it's so important, as you said, differently wired kids can be more intense, and they also, many of them are more sensitive. So even if you feel like some kids may be particularly spacey, or it might seem like they're not actually as connected, they are feeling things often much more deeply, even more intensely. So it's so important to understand how you move through emotions and what your energy looks like. And I learned this the hard way, I discovered pretty early on, when we were going through some really intense years, that the difference between me keeping it cool and not keeping it cool was everything in my house. And, at the time that felt like a lot of pressure on me, like, well, great, no, it's, I have to keep it together, or I'm responsible for the chaos that happens. But, it has forced me to really do that hard work on myself, to model, imperfection as I try to regulate my own emotions, to model strategies for calming down when I notice I'm getting triggered. And I will just add that this is an ongoing process. I think so many of us feel like, well, I've been doing this, so, my child should kind of get it. But we're talking modeling this for years and years and years, just consistency, trying to go to that place of calm. But yes, if those mirror neurons are the real deal, and it's incredible what can happen if you can stay in that place of calm. And so the key for us is to figure out our own personal coping strategy for going to that place.
Yes. I know you talked a lot in your book about self-care being part of that too.
Yeah, I am unapologetically, a self-care fanatic, I guess. And my husband is currently in the U.S., and so we've been here on our own. So I'm single parenting and homeschooling right now, and it's been pretty intense. And I don't, on paper, I don't have as much time for self-care, but you better know that I am getting out for my runs every day. I'm doing my yoga. I need it more than ever.
Yes.
Because if I don't take that time for myself, things could fall apart pretty quickly here.
Yes, you cannot parent from an empty cup.
Definitely not. No.
Well, the beauty of gentle parenting, which is a big part of what this podcast is about, is that you meet your kids wherever they're at and connect and collaborate with scaffolding to move forward through challenges together. The beauty of natural homeschooling or unschooling is that you throw away comparison-based timeline pressure, which we've talked about on this podcast in episodes like reading and math, and question your underlying fears while recognizing effort and progress. The beauty of simple family living is that you shift everything around your child, the environment, the routine, the people, the education, etc., to live a lifestyle in which your whole family can be successful in the ways that you all define for yourselves. The neurodiversity piece can be folded into this way of being as a family so well, including inviting people onto your team for help and support who align with your values, which we talked about in the episode on therapy. But there are a lot of treatments sold to parents under the guise of fixing or normalizing their child, making them more convenient. In your book, you encourage parents to question the intention behind interventions, and I'm going to read a little quote here. Are we doing these things because we want to get into the normal club? Are we hoping that with enough therapy and support, our kids will outgrow who they inherently are and develop in a way that renders their differences not only invisible, but undetectable to anyone but them? Because what I know about autism and ADHD and learning and processing differences is that these things do not go away. Our children can certainly learn skills and strategies and workarounds so they can thrive, but for the most part, no one outgrows their wiring. So my question to you is, what interventions have been helpful for your family and how did you choose them?
Well, everything that you kind of described is what we've done. So we were kind of trying to go down a traditional school path, and we had this opportunity almost 6 years ago to move abroad. And through my husband's job, we were living in Seattle at the time, and we knew that at that time that things were not going well for our family. My son was not thriving at all, the opposite of thriving. He had a lot of anxiety. School was really just not working. And our family was, I think we were in a crisis mode because we were so just stressed and, all coping with it in our own way and not in a good way. And so we knew something had to change, and this opportunity came up. And so we sold our house and we decided, let's just change everything. So we made this radical shift and knew that we would start homeschooling at the time. And that's what we did. We did design our life around really kind of trying to understand who Asher is as a human, as a learner. And we adapted so much. We started traveling more together as a family. Traveling has become something that has really bonded us. The lifestyle here has been really great. So my husband wasn't working the same kind of crazy hours, and we really had to turn to each other because we were starting over. And it was just this magical healing, that happened over a period of years. And it really was all about stop trying to fit into something that wasn't designed for who my child is and that's actually hurting him. Yeah. And instead, we can create whatever we want. I know not everyone has the opportunity to move abroad, but I think we have so much more choice than a lot of us believe in terms of what we could design.
Oh my gosh, I talk about that all the time. So hopefully everybody heard that. Yes, there is some privilege, but we all have a lot more choice in our lives than we realize.
Yep.
Okay, so let's talk about labels. A diagnosis may or may not be a part of your story, but the language we use to story our children is powerful. So I want to invite all the listeners out there to conceptualize and speak to and about your children with the greatest of intention through a strength-based lens. Having a word for something can help our children and the people interacting with them, including us, to better understand them. It can connect us with community and resources in the same way words like natural homeschooling, gentle parenting, and simple living may have connected you to this podcast. In your book, Debbie, you say the greatest gift we can give our differently wired kids is the knowledge of who they are, how their brain works, and what they need to do to create the life they want. Yes, and labels should be something you try on and feel out the goodness of fit. If your child finds it helpful, they can keep it for as long as it feels like a good fit, and they're free to set it down as they learn more about themselves, their unique way of being, and their place in the world, and as perhaps words that are a better fit are picked up. I want to push back on the coercive and authority-imposed nature of labels that often limit and box children in. I also want to point out that you don't need a diagnosis to see your child and meet their needs. So lots of different sides to this coin. How have you seen labels be helpful, and how have you seen labels be unhelpful?
It was really interesting when we were going through the process of doing diagnostic assessment, which we did do because we were in this traditional setting and we wanted to get accommodations in the school environment. Mm-hmm. And, it really was about getting those accommodations. The diagnostician made it clear that, a diagnosis is only as good as the services it gets you. And I was like, that's interesting. That's not really what I went into this process looking for. I wanted to understand better who my child was. And so I thought having a label would give me some context or more information so that I could better understand what he needed. So for us, it was very kind of anticlimactic. I was like, okay, we got a label, not sure that it really fits and not sure that it even matters. So, I think that labels can be helpful. We have talked with Asher about the labels that are associated with him, and it can be helpful for some context or a better understanding of, what's a common experience for other people with ADHD, for example. This is actually something that a lot of people with ADHD struggle with. You're not alone in this. And that can be really helpful. And I think it's important that differently wired people kind of, as you said, they own and feel good about how they want to identify themselves. And I love that word identify. Marcus Sutra, he's the president of Eye to Eye, which is a mentoring organization for kids with learning and attention issues. He said, he refers to when I was identified as having dyslexia, not when I was diagnosed. And I just, even that little tweak, that's a non-medicalized, term, feels so much better. So I think if labels are helpful to provide context and to provide insight that can help you better get what you need to thrive, then I think they're great. But I think we need to be careful about not medicalizing, and I don't use the word disorder because I don't see these as negatives. I see them as information or differences. Right. So I think we need to encourage our kids to own who they are and to discover, that self-discovery piece, who they are.
Oh, I so agree. I think the most important thing from my perspective, especially with my background in family therapy, is that I want to remove that coercive piece. Like each individual, even kids, the way I see it is the adults around them can offer these pieces. Like this piece might be a good fit for you and might really resonate with you and be, one of those pieces to your identity. But they should also have the freedom and the autonomy to try on, accept, decline, evolve, all of those things with those words. I want to empower the kids in these families to have an active role in this whole label discussion.
Yeah, and I think it's important to just have ongoing conversations. We have read many books together and even discussed, like, does this resonate with you, or, does this feel like a fit? Well, and he would say, this does, this not so much. I'm like, yeah, I'd agree with that. Like kind of a take what helps and ditch the rest kind of thing. But I think just continuing to talk with our kids to help develop their emotional intelligence, their sense of just self-awareness and their critical thinking and really understanding who they are and how they fit into the world so that they can own it, and they can feel confident about who they are.
Yes, to focus on getting to learn the language of your kids and what their needs are and what things you can change as a parent and what tools you can provide. Yes to all of that. Like, I feel like sometimes the label can be helpful, but also that the label can open some doors or give you language to understand yourself and your place in the world better, but it's not really the work that you're doing. It's just like one little piece that can help you to get to the real work, which is like what we were talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. Labeled it doesn't fix anything and it doesn't give you an answer. It's just information.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's talk about others. We just had an episode all about judgment with Tracy Gillette from Raised Good. So I want to steer you all back to that episode if you haven't yet listened to it. But it's worth adding a layer when we're talking about raising neurodivergent kids, because we have to engage in that process on a whole other level, right? So explain why.
Yeah, this is probably one of the things I hear from parents the most about is, just the struggles of fitting in. That sense of isolation is pervasive because there's so little understanding about what's really happening in our world. And especially if we're newer to this journey and our kids are younger, and so we don't really know ourselves necessarily what's going on, and our kids, the way they're moving through the world, might be perceived as disruptive or inappropriate or bad behavior. I hate the word behavior, but so I think there's a lot of judging that happens that we can kind of sense or maybe even hear, and we pile it on to what may already be a big sense of failure or sadness or overwhelm that we're already experiencing. And so there's just a real lack of understanding. And there's a sense for a lot of parents with differently wired kids, especially, or with typical kids, in the traditional setting, that, this school is for my child, and kids who are bad behavior or are kind of moving through the world differently are going to disrupt this experience for my child. And so it can become an us versus them kind of a thing. Yeah. And that everyone kind of loses if that's the path we're going down. So it can be very tricky to navigate.
Yeah. And so often, just like we had to work through our reactivity to the way our kids are and the way they interact with the world, all of the other people around our kid are often deep in that reactivity as well. And they perceive the things that make them uncomfortable about our kid as a reflection on our own bad parenting. Like if you just parented how I did, your kid wouldn't be making me uncomfortable right now.
Well, and it's also, and I say this all the time, it's because you're bringing their attention to something that someone else feels really insecure about themselves. Mm-hmm. So that is so important to remember. And I mean, it doesn't help necessarily in the moment, if we're in a public situation and, our child is doing something that all of a sudden all eyes are on us and we're just like, oh my gosh, and we just want to like get out of there and get out of the judgments and the stares. But it's really because we've triggered a fear in that other person. And it's not just other, parents with their kids. It could be even our close friends. It could be our family members who all have ideas about what's going on. Some of them may not even believe that our child is differently wired. They may just think, if you did this, if you parented the way I parented you, this would be going a lot better. So there is just a sense of a lack of understanding that can be really hard. And it just adds to what we're already often feeling as a sense of frustration and failure.
Yeah. In the judgment episode of this podcast, we talked about parenting the same in public that you parent in private, like communicating to your kids that they are acceptable and that you are going to be there for them, no matter what the setting. And I know that I feel personally that I have an added responsibility with differently wired kids to hold the space for them in public to show up as their authentic selves and for that to be okay. So there's sort of this extra, it's almost like advocacy work, right? Where so the attitude when we're in public space is that your kid doesn't have a right to be here sometimes. Like society tells us that with babies too. Like babies don't have a right to exist in public space, with the whole like don't breastfeed in public, your baby can't cry in public, all that jazz. And I really feel the same attitude parenting differently wired kids, that there's this attitude that your kid can only exist in public space if they sit still and are quiet and blah, 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 blah. On and on the list goes, like the list of socially acceptable and convenient behavior. So a big part of my job, which can feel exhausting at times, is holding the space, like holding the negativity of the world back for my kid to exist in the way that they are, even and especially in public spaces. And advocacy work directly. That's another aspect to parenting a differently wired kid, that a lot of neurotypical families, they just don't have that added weight.
Yeah, and I love what you said about, just parenting the same in public and in private, because a lot of parents will over-explain, throw their kid under the bus to save face, to do what they need to protect their own ego in those situations. But just as you said, it's so important that our kid knows that we have their back. What greater gift could we give a child than to know that no matter what, that we are going to love them unconditionally, no matter where we are, that we're going to hold that space for them. It's so important. It's not easy, but it's, I think, the most critical work that we could do.
Agreed. And that process sometimes includes decluttering relationships too, which I know you've talked about in your book, and I've written about in one of my books somewhere, that a lot of times parents will come to me struggling because they had really good friends that they were close with for many, many years before they met their child. And then now that they know who their child is, they experience a lot of pain from the connection with these other relationships, these other connections that are not necessarily, that may no longer be a good fit. So you talk about in the book, and I just totally agree about the importance of decluttering your relationships and choosing with intention who you want to invite into your lives, because you and your kids are a gift to the world. You are not a burden. And so it's important to surround yourself and get connected with people who value you and your child in that light.
Yeah, and not waste time trying to convince people who aren't ever going to get it, it. Like, that is never going to feel good. It's fruitless, and we just don't have the energy for that. We have too much work to do in the world,
Yes, I so agree. Okay, let's move into our Q&A. I posted in my Sage Parenting Tribe on Facebook that we were going to chat about neurodiversity today, and asked if anyone had any questions about it. Melissa asks, how do you get both parents on the same page? And I know you had a great podcast episode in which you interviewed your husband. So what wisdom do you have to share on this question?
Again, this is a whole other episode, but I will just say this is a real tough one, because more often than not, at least from the parents I hear from, the two partners are not on the same page, and it's really can be taxing on a relationship. I think, one of the things I would say is, if you are the parent who's kind of shouldering, the weight of the more intense realities of life with your differently wired child, which might mean kind of just managing all the therapies, or, being the one who's doing all the interface with the teachers, or
being their prefrontal cortex,
or being there, loaning your prefrontal cortex all the time. We can actually, and I was guilty of this, we can get to a place where we start to just almost resent the other partner for not being there with us, and we can become really, greedy about holding on to all of it, which is not what we want. But we just feel like, oh, well, fine, I'm just going to do this all myself, and that can obviously create a further and further divide. So I think it's important for parents to, if you are that person, to release some of the control, to be really clear about what you need from your partner. I recently interviewed someone, it hasn't aired yet, but it was just about how dads can be the dad that their differently wired child needs. And one of the things he said, which I loved, was that I think a lot of times the parent who is the one who's more engaged is expecting their partner to do the same things, to read the same books. If I suggest a book, they should read it. If I suggest a podcast, they should listen to it. If I'm doing this, they should do that too. And that's not realistic, and it's probably not going to happen. So rather look at, okay, we both have different strengths. What can my partner bring to this that's going to contribute in a way that he or she is able to contribute, that's going to let them play into their strengths, that's going to support me in a different way. And so I think we need to get rid of this idea that if their engagement doesn't mirror ours, that they don't care as much. They often just don't know what to do, and they're often struggling with their own kind of personal mourning and journey with understanding who their child is, and their child's not what they expected. So, it starts with really good communication. It takes a lot of time and vulnerability and letting go of some of that control.
Yes, that's brilliant. Something that really helped for me in the earlier days of parenting was to let go of that desire for my partner to parent the exact same way that I am parenting, and what I sort of said to myself, and that was a profound shift for me, was that I was going to let him have his own relationship with each of our kids. So whenever I see maybe him doing something differently than the way I do it, or saying something or handling something differently than I would have handled it, that's sort of the mantra that I say to myself, that I'm going to let him have his own relationship with his kids. And that has been tremendously helpful for me. But just like God, I love all the things you said. And I just want to emphasize that it's not easy. You have to negotiate from a place of understanding that you both want what is best for your kid, and then just negotiate how to best meet this child's needs. So find the common ground and go from there. When we're talking about parenting our kids, we often talk about meeting them where they're at and then progressing from there. You kind of want to do the same thing with your partner. Like, find that common ground, find that meeting place where you both agree, and then just keep it really focused on the kids' needs. Not about any other grievances. If you start a conversation about how best to meet your kids' needs and you end up fighting about the dishes, you've gone way astray. So keep those boundaries, keep those ground rules. If you're going to have a conversation about some need that your kid has that's not being met, have a separate conversation in which you're talking just about that.
I love that. It's great.
Okay, now we're going to move into a day in the life. So describe your favorite day this week and share with us why you loved it.
Wow, that was a hard question to think about. So I'm going to say it was Friday. So, as I mentioned, I live in Amsterdam, and we have the opportunity to travel. That's one of the gifts of living here. And because my husband's not here right now, I've been trying to book a little more travel, because otherwise it's my kid and I staring at each other like, oh, it's you again, with no one to break it up. So we went to Vienna, Austria for the weekend, which I've always wanted to go to see Vienna. It's been on my bucket list for years. And it was this kind of day. It started off okay. It was kind of a typical morning. My son really doesn't love traveling on weekends because he likes to just kind of work on his projects and do his own thing. But we had planned and we were set for it. And but then when it came time to leave, things kind of fell apart, as they sometimes do when we're trying to get out the door to the airport. And so we had kind of a rocky rocky exit. So I had an opportunity to practice loaning out my prefrontal cortex.
Excellent reframe.
And I really, I think I'll just say that for me, like there's so much expectation too. Like, wow, this is my probably once in a lifetime chance to go on this, to see the city I've always wanted to see. And so it's just constant like, okay, but this is my experience and this is his experience. And how do I respect and honor where he's at while not taking on his energy? Like, so all these things are what I was working on while we were in line for security. And I managed to stay in a place of calm and just kind of let him have his time on the airplane to do his thing. I worked. And then we got there, we got checked in, and he needed some downtime. And normally I would have been like, no, we're here. We have to walk around. And I kind of said, you know what? Why don't you hang out in the hotel for an hour, do what you need to do? And I went for a walk by myself, which was such a gift to myself. And I just walked around. I took pictures. I just meandered for an hour, which is my favorite thing to do. And came back to the hotel and grabbed him. And we went to an art museum, which I had explained we were going, but he didn't register. So it was news to him, but we got there. And then we got there and he loves art. So though he wasn't that into it when I first announced it, we ended up having this like lovely time looking at a Monet exhibit together who's one of our favorite artists. And then we went and sat at an outdoor cafe and had schnitzel. Like it was just the loveliest. And we had a really nice conversation over dinner. So it was just this day that could have gone really bad if I had, just allowed myself to get triggered. And I didn't. And I just, so many opportunities to just be in the good and the bad. But the good moments are so good. And I just feel like it's days like that where I'm just really, really fully living my life, the good, the bad, the ugly, the uncomfortable, all of it.
The messy.
It's total, the messy. It's so messy, but it's so beautiful. Like all of that together, as painful and hard as it can be, it's still beautiful.
Oh, I love so many things about that story. It reminds me, you said this thing in your book about how important it is a lot of times with differently wired kids to prepare them in advance for things. And you said something like, one thing I know about you is, with my kids I say, one thing we've learned about you is, ... and then how can we, or what will we do if that happens, or how can I help you if you're feeling this, or ... I love that you talked about how you sort of tried to do that and tried to prepare him, and then sometimes like you just it seems like it always just goes back to that mirroring piece, like that you have to let go of your attachment to outcomes and just focus on what you can control, which is yourself.
Yeah, I think control is the key word. I'm such a planner and an organizer, and I think I keep thinking, all right, well, this time I foolproofed things, and this time I've covered all my bases, and there's no covering all your bases. Like There's always going to be some leak here, that something I forgot, or I just can't predict the reaction. So I have to constantly let go of control, which is probably my life's work.
Yes. Yeah. Sometimes you just got to roll with it. And then it's just all about controlling yourself and being that emotional anchor. And it's so quick. The result is so quick and easy that when I can be that emotional anchor for my kids, they respond so well, and so much more quickly than if I tumble down that rabbit hole with them, and get big in my behavior to match, the chaos that I feel inside, or the lack of control reacting to that. Then it just, everything, all of the hardness gets so much bigger and takes so much longer.
Yeah. Yeah, it's never a good idea to escalate yourself. I learned that also the hard way. Not to say that it doesn't ever happen, but it never goes well when I do, although it gives me an opportunity to apologize and to own it and to talk about what I could have done differently. So,
yeah, I have been known to say, okay, we're just going to take a few minutes to feel this and then we'll move through it together. and again, a lot of times when I'm talking to my kids, I'm kind of talking to myself.
Yeah, I love that. I may be using that later tonight.
Let's take our deep dive. The show notes can be found for this episode at sageparenting.com/podcast19, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. So what are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic? And of course, the first links are going to be the Tilt Parenting podcast and this amazing Differently Wired book.
Well, thank you for that. And I will also, just before I switch to other resources, I have a 7-day Differently Wired challenge on there that people might be interested in. It's basically 7 days of little tilts that you can make in your life to try to just tweak something in your experience of how you're parenting your differently wired child. So that's on Tilt Parenting. And then beyond that, I just wanted to share a couple of my favorite books. There's a book called Uniquely Human by Dr. Barry Prezant, it's about raising kids who are on the autism spectrum, but it's so much more than that. It's really about what we've been talking about today. It's about strength space. It's about not trying to change kids to adapt to who we as society think they should be, but rather understand who they are and meet them where they are and know that they're perfect as they are. So that's one of my favorite books on this topic. And I'm also a fan of Andrew Solomon's book, Far from the Tree. If listeners maybe are familiar with that, he has a new documentary out based on the book, but he talks to parents raising kids who are different from them, not just special needs, but just kids who are different from the child they expected, and then how did those families move through that. So it's a great book. And then I'll just share 3 of my favorite resources for parents who might be raising differently wired kids. One is called understood.org, and that is a website just packed with the most useful, practical content and strategies for parents who have kids with learning and attention issues. Hey Sigmund, I mentioned before, and yes, she writes a lot about anxiety in kids, but also a lot just about brain science. She's really good at breaking down bigger concepts and making them user-friendly and practical. And then the last one, this is one of my go-to resources now, this man named Seth Perler. He's an executive functioning coach.
He had some episodes on your podcast.
Yes, 5. I'm such a fan. He is differently wired. He shares his, what he does through such a place of passion and commitment for really helping complicated kids thrive. And he has just so many videos and amazing resources for free on his website, and he just has the biggest heart. So if you have a child who's struggling with any kind of executive functioning, emotional regulation, all of those things, he would be a great resource.
Excellent. And there are a bunch of resources that you've listed, like books I haven't read. I loved Seth Perler's episodes on your podcast, but I haven't yet been to his website, and I totally need to look up some of his videos. So those are really great, and I'm going to write all of those down and include links to all of those things in the notes for this episode. Debbie, thank you so much for joining me all the way from Amsterdam and having this really important conversation. A lot of us parents, parenting differently wired kids, can feel pretty alone and almost villainized and sometimes defeated. So it's really nice to know that A, we're not alone, and B, us and our kids can absolutely grow to be our best selves and can be living our best lives. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the conversation and for the work that you do in the world. There's so much alignment in how we see this journey, so I really appreciate that.